Welcome to Unsolicited Book Reviews with Michael David MacBride. That's me! I read a lot of books, and sometimes people ask for recommendations. No one explicitly asked for reviews of these books on this podcast. These are just ones that I've enjoyed. I read across genres, and really whatever happens to come across my path. Sometimes that's a book within a book, or sometimes that's a source that's listed as a reference for a book, or an interview with another author. Sometimes it's just a new book by a favorite author. And other times people have made recommendations, but by the time I've gotten around to reading them, I've kind of forgotten where that recommendation came from. Oops. Unlike most episodes, this one is going to be a conversation about one book. This one, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, with friend Bill Gibson from Fine Print Books in Saline, Michigan. I asked Bill to pick out a book, and he chose Legends and Lattes. I'd never heard of it before, but I bought a copy from his store. We both read it independently and haven't shared our thoughts before now. Ready? Let's go. Thanks for joining me with Unsolicited Book Reviews. Today I'm joined by very special guest, Bill Gibson from Fine Print Books in Saline, Michigan, my hometown. And when I was home for the holidays, I stopped in, like I always do whenever I'm around, and chatted with Bill a bit. And I talked this idea about reviewing a book, and we share book tastes, and it seemed like a natural fit. So, welcome, Bill. And why don't you tell me a bit about yourself?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me first and foremost. Always raised to be polite. Uh, yeah. So my wife and I opened Fine Print Bookshop about 2 years ago now, and Michael was actually one of our actually was our very first author event at the store. So it was there's a lot of reciprocity here, and we we loved having you. And then you came back again for another event, and it was for the Great Clavet, actually. Congratulations, by the way, on that.
Yeah,
But,
thanks. It's been
yeah,
it's been really fun. I've loved doing those events with you guys, and I know I told you this personally, but I guess for everybody else, like growing up in Saline, we didn't have a bookstore. But very close to where you guys are situated, there was a like five and dime or dime store or whatever it was called,
yeah.
and they had a spinner rack of comics and often romance novels, and that was where I would get my comic books. But the problem was the proprietor didn't care, and so they were always like the same old comic books, and they like I would get like, issue 127 and then 139, and like there was nothing in between.
A bit of a
So
gap there.
I was so delighted when you guys opened, and it's been great to be part of that. So
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Uh, the demand was there. We didn't know that. We just kind of felt it that it was there. But then we opened, and the response was more than we could have ever anticipated. So we've been very lucky in that regard. The community has been very welcoming for us.
yeah, that's awesome. And I try to get back whenever I can, and it's always
Yeah,
fun to go into the store and see what you guys are doing. I know you're building kind of a new space for events, and I love the way you have your books organized, and that Lindsay does a lot of the design and the labeling and that kind of stuff as well. So
yeah.
you guys are a really wonderful team that way. Wow.
Thank you. Yes, she tells me what I need to build, and eventually I build it. Yeah.
That's a good way to work, I'm sure. So
Yeah.
so today's book is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. And I even have my fine print bookmark still in there from picking it up. Um,
Excellent.
and this was not a book that I had ever heard of. Books come at you all different ways, and I'm sure as a bookseller, even more so for you. Sometimes I forget how I came across a book, or how it even appeared on my radar. I'm kind of curious. Do you remember where you first heard about Legends and Lattes and what that story is?
Yeah, so this one, it was one of those that we kept as we were looking at ordering and filling out the shelf, because it's a never-ending process, especially 2 years in. Uh, we're just now, I think, kind of satisfied with the amount of books on our shelves, and have gotten to the point now where we have to decide, are we going to keep a book or lose a book? But in a lot of my research into the fantasy genre, this one kept popping up. Uh, kind of under the radar. Uh, and it looked like an interesting premise, but it was one thing we learned when we opened was that with books, we do often uh, end up judging the book by the cover a little bit before we make a final decision on it. So it, I'll just getting active now. So that one, it at first we weren't sure about it, but then I just kept reading different blogs about it. There's different bookseller groups, and everyone was just so enamored with this book that finally, like, you know what, we got to bring it in. And I think we had it in a week, and we sold it. And so it's kind of rare to bring in a book and sell it that quickly. But then Travis, he released the prequel a little bit earlier or it was late last year that he released the sequel, and so by that point we were kind of all in on it. And uh, so after finding all of that out and bringing it in, it kind of slowly seeped into my own consciousness about wanting to read it. So yeah, that's how it kind of came to
I'm
me.
yeah, I'm fascinated by like the bookstore world. I mean, that is just not something that I ever gave any thought to. I just assumed like the books magically appeared, and and obviously, a lot of my experience early on were um, like Walden Books and those kind of kind of the bigger chain stores, and I'm sure in those they do kind of magically appear, and they just go on the shelves. But with a
Right.
with an independent bookstore where you're making those choices, and like you said, you have limited space and you need to figure out what's going to sell, but also what represents your interests as well. That's just really interesting to me, and
Yeah.
I assume like, do you get early readers or arcs and that kind of stuff, or like what other kind of things come your way that tell you that a new book is coming out?
Absolutely. So we do get the early readers, the ARCs. So oh yeah, so we tend to get a lot of ARCs, both like I said, solicited and unsolicited. But then um, we also learned that book publishing feels like it's kind of a romantic thought when when you're looking at the creative side of it, but it's maddening when you're looking at the business side of it. But it's kind of a business that's been stuck in uh, a bygone era where there's still book reps and booksellers who call us up and say, let's talk about some books that are coming out. And uh, so we have these meetings with different book reps, and that's how we learn about new books. But uh, yeah, a lot of times TikTok has become a huge thing too. And that's another place where I've seen a lot of interest in Legends and Lattes. It usually will end up on everyone's favorite list, or at least if they're talking about cozy fantasies, that ends up on there quite frequently as well.
That's a whole genre that I didn't realize existed.
Yeah.
And I read pretty widely, and but I'm always surprised when I like discover some new thing. Like
Yes.
my grandmother, I always knew my dad's mom, always read mysteries, and
Mhm.
I mean, she has probably thousands of mysteries, and she keeps them all, which I'm also like kind of fascinated by because I don't think she rereads them. And her approach is, and she would tell me this repeatedly: I get the book and I flip to the end and I read the end of the book first, so that then I'm not frustrated. Um, and what I learned from her is all of the mysteries because I had also never heard of any of the authors that she was reading. And it was like, how have you discovered all of these books by people
Yeah.
that I've never heard of before? They're never bestsellers, they're never any of these things. And she said, well, like I like mysteries that end happily. And if there's a murder, it happens off screen. I don't need the blood and gore. And so then
Sure.
I learned like they're cozy mysteries. And again, that was like one of those things I didn't know. This is the first cozy fantasy I've ever discovered. So it was interesting, and um, I enjoyed it quite a bit. Like it
Yeah.
was, I don't know. I'm curious. Were you a D&D'er? Did you do any of Dungeons and Dragons and role play and that kind of stuff?
It's funny as we continue talking, everything it keeps, there's that one more thing that oh yeah, I forgot to mention. This is also how I got into it. So yeah, I would say I'm actively playing D&D, but actively playing D&D in the way that a lot of people understand, in that I'm between games and still scheduling those to play. So yeah, that also drew a lot of my interest, because it did seem like, oh, this is exactly what we never talk about when we play D&D, is what do our heroes do after they retire. So it was
Yeah.
yeah, it really drew me in because of that as well.
I did D&D in like middle school, high school, and the problem that I kept running into was I never found the right fit of people to like
Hmm.
stick with.
Yeah.
One of my very good friends, Jason, he's a couple of years older than I am, and he still gets together with the same group, and they have a campaign that is continuing to go on. In fact, they just like celebrated, I want to say their 35th anniversary or something of
Wow.
their of playing together. And so they actually went away to a cabin and they spent that time doing their campaign and having fun and celebrating in general as well. But I found myself buying all of the rule books and being fascinated by like that part of the game. You
Hmm.
know, that somebody came up with all these different scenarios and these tables, and you know, this dice roll is that. And but I never felt confident as a DM to be the storyteller and build the world or any of that stuff. And I was a terrible player because you know, the DM would do something. I'd be like, that's not right. I know on page 179 of the Dungeon Master's Handbook, it says this. And, you know, like I was that kind of person. And then I was also the dumb fighter who just did stupid things. So,
Yeah.
um, but it was really, I mean, I guess to talk about the book a bit, you know, like you said, it really its premise is that you have Viv, the barbarian, orc barbarian, who wants to retire. You know, she's kind of done her one last job, and what do you do in retirement? And I
Exactly.
love that premise. You know, she's left her party behind. It was like, well, Fennis comes back and Rune and Galena, I think. I can't remember all their names exactly. But, you know, she had this party that she clearly was involved with and knew them well. And she leaves them behind and then goes and runs, you know, does her own thing. And then builds community, which is almost like building another party, which
Right.
I really loved that kind of parallel there. I thought that was kind of fun. So
I did not make that connection, but yeah, it does. It is like building out a party of these differing people who bring different skill sets that to run a business you would need to make it successful. So it is very much like that.
yeah, I was sitting there. I mean, for people who haven't read it, you know, basically, you know, Viv has coffee, and she knows this from the gnomes that she encountered on an adventure, and she's fascinated by this thing, and so she gets this, you know, machine to make coffee, and nobody knows what coffee is. So
Right.
part of it is this kind of hilarious thing of wanting to start a business that nobody understands
Yes.
where you
There's
are starting that business. And so I imagine as a small business owner, you can kind of connect to that idea of like, we want to do this thing. And hopefully people will be there and come along and join us.
luckily people knew what books were before we opened, so we didn't have to introduce all of that to everyone. I'd say 89% of the people knew what a book was before we opened. So uh,
And games and all and the puzzles and
yeah,
everything else you
that's
have
yeah,
as well. So yeah.
yeah,
But then she, you know, acquires people, like you said, of different skill sets. Because a good, you know, D&D party isn't just made up of fighters. You know, you need the cleric
right.
and the wizard and all the people to do the different roles. And so she pretty quickly finds people to help supplement that. You know, there's the baker, and even then, like listening to her clientele, like the stubborn student who won't drink hot beverages. You know,
Right.
like, oh, we need to find a way to reach out to him. And
Connect with
um,
yeah. Well, and I think that the most fantastical element of this whole book that creates or that involves a orc and a tiefling and mouse people and people never knowing what coffee was to see an open to suggestions owner of a place that she's willing to to take in all these ideas and give up some control of her own store to other people and allow them to help her business grow. I feel like that was the most fantastical element when you think about how capitalism works sometimes.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the things I struggle with sometimes in fantasy is how much time the author spends, um, spelling out the details of each
Mhm.
race or whatever. And one of the things I really enjoyed in this is Baldree just kind of assumes a familiarity, and
Exactly.
there are some that I didn't know. Like I don't know what a hob carpenter is, for instance. I was like, I don't even know what that is, but that's all right. That's just that guy.
Yeah.
And that's just Kale. Got it. Okay. And you can kind of roll with these labels and just realize like it is a different thing, whether you know much about the world or not. Were you more familiar with any of the other kind of races built into the story other than like the orc and gnome and succubus?
Yes. Yep. There's the little uh, hobgoblin at the beginning, which I think he basically meant that to represent just a goblin, just based on like height and descriptions. Uh, so yeah, it's just a basically little green guy. Generally in D&D and fantasy, goblins are they tend to have the reputation of uh, evil creatures or mischievous creatures, and he kind of plays into that too when describing how forget his name, but how he doesn't find work easily until people see his actual abilities and skills. Then they tend to hire him. But uh, our Viv, she takes to him right away and just kind of understands from what he's describing that he knows what he's talking about, and uh, takes him under his wing, which was a it's just a really positive message, I think, too, to look past people and see what they're or to look past how they look and who they are supposed to be, or stereotypes, and to see who they actually are, what skills they possess. It's the uh, very definition of meritocracy, basically, to see who they are and take that versus who they look like or could are supposed to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was one of the things that it is I never thought about when I was younger playing D&D, but one of the cool things about that game was how it literally brought races together.
Mm-hmm.
There were benefits to having elves and dwarves and dark elves and whoever else in your party. And while it was explicit because it was literally on your character sheet, race, colon, whatever, right after it, um, it never felt like there was discrimination, against that, and obviously some of the books certainly play with those ideas, like the R.A. Salvatore books with Drizzt or Dritz or however you want to say his name,
Yeah.
the dark elf, certainly plays with that idea of this kind of outward expression causing problems. But you're right, and I didn't put that together. I think immediately she talks about Kale as the hobgoblin, and then
Yeah.
very quickly it's abbreviated to Hob, the Hob Carpenter, and I must have missed that. I didn't make that connection, but you're right. Goblins are generally unsavory. They cause havoc. They're in big groups and that kind of stuff. And yet here you have this carpenter who does incredible work, and is lonely.
Yeah.
He's on his own. He's not in a big group. I mean, he's not a big army of goblins swarming.
Yes, and he's
But
he's quiet and reserved, which is often, I don't believe, part of the stereotype for that group either. They tend to be loud and devious and blow things up. Often, if you play Magic the Gathering, definitely blow things up.
yeah, definitely. And you have the shy bard, right, who is like
Yes, yes.
embarrassed of his performance, but essentially has an electric guitar. And I don't know, for me, like again, not having encountered a cozy before, I don't have anything to compare this to in cozy fantasy, but it was not boring. I
Yeah.
assumed if someone told me like, oh, this is a cozy fantasy, go read this, I would be like, oh, it's gonna be slow and there's not gonna be suspense or whatever. Like it's going to just kind of be relation building. Um, it does a really good job of having momentum, and
Agreed. Yeah.
I read through it very quickly, and I wanted to see where these characters developed, and it took me a little while to realize that Baldree was essentially building a very modern coffee shop. By the end of
Yes.
the book,
Yeah.
spoilers, by the end of the book, you have lattes, you have cold beverages, you
Yep.
have
Yep.
hot coffee, you have all kinds of pastries, you know.
Yeah. It was. I think that's a lot of what kind of pulled it along for me too. Was you have this suspense of, well, what are they going to develop next? What's the next thing that's going to push this coffee shop into the next tier of this little town? And I also enjoyed uh, there was a little B storyline in there about the local mafia. It kind of
Yes.
loomed large over the entire coffee shop, but then all of a sudden, when it kind of comes to fruition, it takes this different twist that maybe you were anticipating, maybe not, but it was nice to see that kind of play out differently than it normally does, because you would
Yeah.
anticipate as there's I call it another character in the book, but her sword that she had gone through all of these adventures with also kind of looms in the background, and you're expecting her to pick this sword up and become righteous and take back her coffee shop, or to protect her coffee shop, and that also plays out a little bit differently. And for that, I was very happy to see uh,
Yeah, I
that
love
twist.
I love those elements to it. You're right. It's she makes that decision to retire and
Mhm.
literally hangs up her sword. Her sword is um it was
I,
black blood or something like that,
yes,
or
so
black
it's yeah.
vein, I can't remember. And she literally has it mounted over there. And initially, I think early in the book, Viv makes a comment about that'll ward off any troublemakers or something like that. Because she's in that transition phase of like
Mhm.
trying to retire, but still having kind of those tendencies, that it's easier to solve things with a sword sometimes than it is to with your words.
Yes.
And then you're right. Then the mafia kind of comes around trying to collect protection money, and that is an opportunity where she could have, being much larger and physically domineering, and with this sword and her adventures behind her, probably have done some serious damage and protected herself that way if she wanted to. But part of her maturation process is like, nope, I'm committed to that retirement idea.
Yeah.
Um, and then kind of the undercurrent also is like that sense of betrayal, maybe, for leaving her party and taking this kind of magical element, this the stone, or it was like Skelvert stone, I think, out of the
Mhm.
Queen, and like reliance on magic,
Yeah.
and whether you can do it on your own or whether you need a charm to kind of make that thing happen as well. And um, yeah, it is really nice to see the different ways Baldtree takes the story, and not not predictably,
Right.
so so I don't know that you knew that I was into D&D before
No, no,
we
that was
chatted.
a pleasant
Um,
surprise. Yeah.
I'm curious then, like when I posed the idea to you, what sparked this book as, and I made the choices because you had so many in your store.
Yes.
What was it about this that grabbed you and said, let's do this?
So part of it was selfishness, in that it was already on my list to read. And so I think when you asked, uh, I had started it, or I was about halfway through. And I thought, this is one of those books that I think it's easily read, it's easily reviewed, um, because when we first got on the call, we were discussing how you like to keep things positive, and I love that. I think that's fantastic. Uh, but I seriously sat here and thought, I don't know that I can think of a negative thing to say about the book anyway. So as a person who likes to be positive as well, it was a pretty easy choice to lean towards this one because the most negative thing I can say about it and is that I want more from that world. And so there, he happened to release, like we talked about, Bone Dust and Bookshops earlier or late last year. So uh, it's it was on my list already. So it made it a pretty easy choice.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I've learned that making book recommendations is kind of a risky business.
Yes.
And I know in my former life I was a teacher, and I would teach English and literature, and I inevitably put together my syllabus and built it with like books that I um, liked. For the most part, some of the books on there were books that I really, really enjoyed. And I'll never forget the experience of teaching it to 25 students and having them hate it. And I was
Yes.
like, how do you hate this book? This is my jam, and like that. And honestly, it kind of steered me away from using books that I felt too passionately about because I
Sure.
didn't want that. I didn't want that reaction. But I know there have been times where I've made recommendations to people about books, and like I keep waiting, like, what's your reaction? Like, come on, let's have this
Right.
conversation. And either I've learned that people are very slow readers, or there aren't they're not all wired like I am. Like I make
Yeah.
recommendations. My friend Dan, and he he enjoys a variety of books. He doesn't read very many books in the year, and so probably the ones that he does, he picks to make the ones that he's going to definitely enjoy. And he accuses me of always making recommendations of thinky books, ones that are too challenging, that are not ones that he wants to listen to or read on the beach. Where I'm like, why would you not want to read this on a beach? Like any of these books would be interesting.
Right.
So I'm just kind of curious, like in terms of, because people come in and ask you, I assume, for recommendations all the time. Like, what do you need to find out from somebody to kind of figure out whether something's going to be a good fit or not?
Well, I did not. I'm anxious now because this always happens with the recommendations. But that is probably hands down the most difficult thing to do in the store uh, is to make a recommendation to someone. So usually, what I try to do, or what I think a majority of the time, you can make a suggestion of a book that you are really passionate about, and if you make the case for it, make the plea for it well enough that they'll read it and come back and still say, it wasn't my favorite or it wasn't my cup of tea, but I really see why you liked it, and because of that, I liked it too. Uh, I might not go back and grab another one from that same genre or
Sure.
similar, but so often though, what we look for are just kind of talking to people about their likes anyway. Uh, so what books have you read in the past? I mean, that's kind of an obvious one, but what are your favorite kind of movies? How do you read? Do you read at night in bed? Do you wake up in the morning and read? Do you read
Hmm.
all the time? Is it you try to grab 15 minutes here? Do you have to regiment your time to a certain amount of time just to make sure you can get reading in? Because based on all of that, I would make a different recommendation to each person. For someone who has to set aside 10 minutes a day to read, that's all they get. I'm not going to recommend a slow reader. I'm going to recommend something like Legends and Lattes where they can read for 10 minutes, get something out of it, and then move on with the rest of their day. I'm being a little dramatic with the 10 minutes. I don't think I've ever had someone tell me they can only read 10 minutes, uh, but someone else who wants to have their life influenced you or changed in some way, you look at a different book that uh, but we have people come in all the time and say, you know, I need help finding something that um, to help my uncle, dad, friend, sister, brother, something understand something better or differently. And so then that's when we kind of feel the real weight of it. And
Sure.
you're like, that's a lot of pressure to put on someone. But and then other times you have someone come in and you're like, I want to read a real quick read, and you're like, well, here, read Fourth Wing. And then after you send that out the door, you're like, oh no, that has that really saucy scene in it. I'm uncomfortable for when they come back, because if they didn't like that, it's a really awkward conversation we're about to have.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. It's funny. I mean that the part about like just kind of the saucy scene, like I I know my memory is fleeting. Like I remember things I remember enough, but I often need things to kind of like jar me to remember minutia. And in terms of like listening to music, I love music, but I don't always listen to the lyrics until when I had children. Then I was like, yeah, listen to this song, and I was like, oh,
Yeah.
wow, I should really think about it. So I could imagine like in books where, like you said, there's like one of what's that book? It's called A Little Life, and it's a big book, which
Mhm.
often scares people away.
Yes. Yeah.
But I love that book, and after a while, I kind of forgot exactly what I loved about the book, other than like it made me cry and it was really deeply tragic. Like those are like basically like the sensory memories that I have of that
Yeah.
book. And then I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, it's got same-sex relationships. So anybody who's comfortable uncomfortable with that, like, might not like that book the way I enjoyed the book, because that didn't bother me. And it just like these were two people who were like in this really tragic relationship. And oh, and then there's a lot of abuse in that book as well. And but like that's part of like what, like so I can't imagine. I don't begrudge. I don't envy your position of trying to do recommendations for people, um, because there's a lot packed in a book recommendation, especially if it's something you love. But like you said, if you know, one of the things I find sometimes that helps with recommendations is not even the book, but it's like the author. Like
Yeah.
why should you like this author? Well, like this one, like Travis Baldree, I found it super interesting that he wrote it as a NaNoWriMo, like through the month of November, writing a novel, a version of it,
Yep.
and then he self-published at one point. And then a publisher found it because of all the attention it was getting. And then, now he's on a traditional publishing house. And
Yeah.
now he has a sequel slash prequel out, and and he's clearly doing a really good job of continuing the stories and that kind of stuff. And that almost is exciting, in a way that people I think can kind of hook their teeth into and go like, wow, I like that story. And if I like that author enough, then maybe I like the book that they produce. So
Exactly. And uh, he also developed Fate, if I remember correctly. He was a video game designer as well. So
yeah,
it's it's interesting because you can really, yeah, really recommend an author based on some of their own interest as well, and know that they're going to handle uh, an IP or handle a story in a way that you can relate to because you enjoyed their game, or maybe they played for a team that you enjoyed. Or but Greg Harden just wrote like a self help type book, and a lot of people can make that connection because of U of M in our area. Uh,
sure.
and so that kind of thing helps to a little more buy-in when you go to pick up a book, because you feel connected to that person that way too. I had actually not thought about maybe basing it on authors as well to kind of connect them as a personal story. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for recommending Legends and Lattes. I really enjoyed it. It's definitely going to continue to be on my list of authors to kind of see what they're up and doing.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I'm curious, do you have things going on at the stores or anything else that you want to promote that's up and coming?
We aren't currently, so we do have we've got some construction going on now. We've got plans are starting to move, so we're very excited about that. So as soon as that happens, we're hoping to ramp up more events and things like that at the store. I'm excited about a new book coming out on February 14th. called The Love Formula. I've been loving it so far.
I did not put him up to this.
I couldn't remember the author's name. That embarrasses me. So maybe if you could put it in the show notes for me, that would be great. Yeah. But I have been reading it. The cat made the appearance, but no, it's wonderful. I love it. So yeah, not much else going on.
Cool. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you joining me here on Unsolicited Book Reviews. And if you're in Saline, definitely recommend stopping in Fine Print. I know whenever I go home, I do. And I'm actually going to be home this weekend, so I'm sure I'll stop up there and say hi in person. So, but thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about me at my webpage, michaelmacbride.com, or on most social media platforms with the same handle, at Michael MacBride. That's MacBride, like Mac and Bride. Let me know what you're listening to, or if you read one of these books, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Have a great day.